Hey everyone, this is Gary. I'm letting you know of a special event that we are going to be hosting at McFleshman's. I'm celebrating the 5-year anniversary of my other podcast, Everything Everywhere Daily. So I'm going to be hosting an event at McFleshman's on the evening of Saturday, July 19th. We're extending this to all of the Respecting the Beer listeners as well. In addition to meeting me in person, you'll be able to have a 547 personally poured by Joel. You'll be able to talk about the science of beer with Allison, and maybe even get a quick tour of the brewery and talk astronomy with Bobby. But mostly, you'll be able to meet a bunch of other very curious, interesting people who love beer. If you'd like to attend, please RSVP in the link provided in the show notes so we can get an idea of how many people will be showing up, and there should be also a link in the Facebook group. Hope to see you in person on July 19th. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt. We got the usual suspects with us. We have the man who, if he could travel back in time, would go back to the year 547, the historian of hops, Joel Hermansen.
During the reign of Justinian.
Sounds like a great time.
I think that was a little after Justinian.
Oh.
What year was the Justinian plague, Bobby?
Phone a friend, Gary.
True story. I was a phone a friend for someone on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
am not surprised at all.
Lost on the second question. Never got to use it.
Aww.
And the voice you just heard. What?
He was emperor in 547.
Oh, there you go. 547 is associated with plague and disease. All right, we've associated that now, thanks to Joel. The man who's working on a way to drink nitro beer in zero gravity, Mr. Bobby Fleshman.
Thanks, Gary.
And Allison McCoy Fleshman, whose recent paper on Schrodinger's cask. You don't know if it's full or empty until you actually open it. Really looking forward for that paper to come out. That's going to be a good one.
That's so good. I'm teaching
our
quantum
Halloween
mechanics right now. Or not at this moment, but at Lawrence right now. And that's, I'm going to be using that in class.
Feel free.
I will.
My gift to you.
Go team.
So today we got Joel here. We want to go back into history, and we want to talk about women in brewing, because brewing and this used to be very much a women's thing.
Yes.
Like, you associated brewing with women, and there's a whole bunch of things that kind of have trickled down that many people don't realize today are associated with that. We'll get into that later. But
So can I explain, first of all, where the genesis for this episode came from?
From Genesis?
We're not going to go quite back to Genesis.
Which drummer? Wait.
I think they only had one. Phil Collins, right?
I guess Peter Gabriel was not a drummer.
No.
Okay, yeah.
No. I think he played a number of things. He may have played drums occasionally, but
All right.
anyway, we were doing the McFleshman's Beer Academy, the history section, which this year was delightfully on the history of beer in the world's focus. And during one of the episodes, we were talking about Martin Luther and his beer life, his beer culture, which was heavily dependent on his wife, Katerina. To which you said from the back of the room, Allison, I'm pointing
to me.
Pointing at Allison, said that we need to do an episode on the role that women have played in beer production.
So really we should flip that script, and rather than the role that women have played, if you're talking about historical beer production, you really are talking about women dominantly doing the work.
For most of the history of it.
So
Right.
it's kind of, it's nice to think that, it's like, oh, it's a man's thing. No, y'all are new to this game. You're youngins.
For those of you who are listening in and not here with us, during that segment, Allison looked directly at Bobby.
That's because
Judge.
I can look at him with the mean eye, and he's married to me, so it's fine.
Right.
But if I give you the mean eye, that's
I would cower.
you would.
It would
you
be
would.
frightening.
You would not know what to do.
Right.
Meanwhile,
Power
I'm daydreaming
within.
about projects that'll cost a bunch of money. So, continue. I'm looking at you, thinking about the projects.
Now the eyes are gleaming.
Yeah.
Anyway, history of women. Go.
Right. So
Educate us, Joel.
yeah, thank you.
In brewing.
Yes, I did a deep dive into this recently, and I have consulted a wide array of materials.
Chat GPT.
No, there was no AI consulted in the production of my materials. I even used one of my I teach high school history, one of the old textbooks has the most magnificent stat in it that I'll be sharing in just a little bit. So to build off of what you were saying, beer has largely, for 85 to 90% of the human experience, beer has been dominated by women.
Yep.
From where we sit in 2025, I don't think we really give that a great deal of consideration, but it's really quite true. When you go all the way back, when you go way, way back, and I wish he was here with us, but when Charlie Bamforth was here and he talked about that famous quote, linking beer to civilization, I mean, there's a number of different people, such as Patrick McGovern, who is the professor of beer archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the greatest jobs in history. And by the way, we need to get him on this podcast. And women were always doing the gathering, the cultivation of grains, of honey, of nuts, anything that they were using in that early beer making process, women were gathering, and men were often out, hunting and doing other things. So there was a clear separation even at that time, and the cultivation of beer fell squarely upon the women.
And this really shouldn't be surprising.
It shouldn't.
It makes perfect sense.
That this wasn't commercial brewing. This is brewing for the home, the family, or extended family.
The potable water source.
yeah.
And it was the way that you had drinkable water.
Right. And I think the one part of it, though, that we should never minimize is all of the trial and error that went into that early period of brewing. I mean, how much trial and error do you have in a given week? You have a ton of trial and error.
Oh, my God.
Right. And I was actually thinking about the motivation for brewing in general has evolved from those times. We do it as, well, a business, but art, right? And back then, Allison points out was potable water source.
Yeah.
And
You
the
ate
trial
your
and
bread,
error
you drank your
there
beer.
has its own, that brings hops into the equation and alcohol and so on and so on.
Yeah. So, I mean, the amount of experimentation that women were doing also is not something that they're assigned the appropriate credit for.
Right.
And this, is an unfortunate part of the human story, I think, sometimes, that we don't assign credit where credit is due in this case. But women were, particularly when you consider the fact that beer and science have always had a very strong connection.
Yeah. Well, and I think if we go pre-industrial revolution, when science and I'm kind of thinking of alchemy almost, that it was almost like a medicinal type thing. And so the science was really more of a medicinal approach to kind of a natural philosopher of, okay, just I can make something from the earth do something for me in a particular way. And making water that won't make you, or coming up with something of a water that won't make you sick, it had more medicinal properties in the fact that, okay, this is what we're going to ingest. And so the science to make that happen, I don't think that they ever thought of it as a science.
But so many of the early scientific breakthroughs weren't thought of
True.
as science.
Yeah.
They were based in method, though.
Yeah.
Sure.
It was like, oh, this just
Yeah.
works better.
Right. And I have no doubt that even prehistoric, the first beer cultivation is usually regarded at about 8,000 years before Common Era. Even then, there was a certain amount of trial and error. This worked, this didn't. I'm going to try this while maintaining this, which is why, again, there's a huge connection to science
Yeah.
in this. There's also a huge connection to religion.
Yes.
And it's not...
I would say more so than science.
Right.
Initially.
Right. And it's not a mistake that in early cultures like the one we were talking about pre-show, in Sumer and in Egypt, the deities assigned to beer were women. I don't think we can ignore that fact.
Are we going to talk about Ninkasi now?
You absolutely
Yes.
take
And we're
it.
talking about a time before hops, too. We should say that this is what we
Yeah.
would call ale. If you're in
Yes.
England, this is what we would call these ales.
Yes.
So
But, yeah.
there's a wonderful book that I've only gotten halfway through. But it's A Woman's Place in the Brew House. And it's by Tara Nurin. And it's a forgotten history of alewives, brewsters, witches, and CEOs. But chapter 4 is the hymn to Ninkasi. So Ninkasi, am I saying that right? How do y'all say
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, Ninkasi.
Cool.
Yeah.
So she was the Sumerian goddess of beer. And she, there's this wonderful thing. So supposedly she had a good publicist. So there is a hymn to Ninkasi. And it was the first known written beer recipe. In cuneiform tablets in 1800 BCE near modern Turkey, they found this. Hymn to Ninkasi was a repetitive poem sung in a way that describes the Sumerian process of beer making. So Joel's talking about just the experimentation and how do you make the same thing twice. And I know many times we've asked, would beer be good back then? And to have a way to repeat, the written language was being developed at this time. And so the clay tablets of Sumeria, they are actually some of the original written form. And this hymn to Ninkasi, this kind of ode to the goddess of beer, is really just a beer recipe. And so it's like some of the first writings and some of this first poetry was about beer and, luckily, to Ninkasi.
Yeah, and they also think that the first writing was done to keep track of grain transactions and beer transactions.
Well, and there's a wonderful quote in this book as well. Just where did it go? Grain was edible money. And so the beer and the bread were the currency of the day. And so the tax documents and such were really just marking the tick marks on the clay tablets of like, well, how much beer bushels did you get or how much bread bushels did you get?
Right.
All links back to beer.
And in Egyptian civilization, we have, not to diminish what was happening in Mesopotamia, but we have a treasure trove of material related to women in brewing. The Egyptian goddess Tenenet was the goddess of beer, is a prime example of that. But we have so many pictures, hieroglyphs. This is one of those seconds I wish this was a visual podcast. We could show you some of these, but of women making beer with the paddles, similar to the ones that we use today, holding Egyptian beer mugs, if you will. I mean, it's absolutely unmistakable. And again, this is where we really start to see the migration from domestic production, which you had alluded to a few minutes ago, Gary, from domestic production to more of a commercialized approach, because Egypt starts to transition into formal brew houses. There was a McFleshman somewhere near the Giza Plateau, I'm guessing. And to quote Patrick McGovern as he was commenting on early civilization, he said this: women were the ones who made the fermented beverages. I mean, it's
And
as
stop. End of podcast.
plain, yeah, right.
We did it.
Best-selling beer at the McFleshman's at Giza was an Ankh 47. Continue.
You're just going to drop that in and expect,
Yes.
okay?
Oh my God. That's so great.
That is hard to do. And I would also point out one of our other favorite beer drinking cultures would be the Vikings. And the Vikings actually had formal writings that mandated that women produce the beer, which was called AULE, by the way.
Oh.
All, I'm guessing, is I don't speak Viking, but I'm guessing it's something similar to that. And obviously the spelling is unmistakable. We're getting ale in there because we're not adding hops. We're using, particularly in pre-Viking age culture, we're using the yeast from the air.
Yep.
And I like it when you talk about air yeast. So can you take that one?
Air
for us?
yeast. Speak,
I like
Bobby.
that. Yeah, I always say microflora. I
Or
heard,
that.
I
See,
heard,
that sounds
I
better.
heard that at some point. And I think it sounds really intelligent.
It does, yeah.
But air yeast is actually better for tours, I think. So next I say it'll be
no,
about
it's
air
not.
yeast.
It does not sound pretty. Microflora.
So yeah, I mean that you have a mixture of yeast and you have bacteria, and you can inoculate sugar water with that, and these bacteria and yeast go through metabolic pathways that make alcohol. And acids, and the combination of those two things are what give us these spontaneous fermented beers and so on. Wines are done that way for sure.
I'm just going to interject and go back to the origin of words and stuff. Not that I don't think that air yeast is fascinating,
Yeast.
but
That's all I had.
there's not
I didn't
much
know there was
after that.
microflora.
So I want to go back to the Sumerians with the cuneiform tablets and reading about the different words. So they had specific words such as ikeru, daida, and eber to refer to classifications such as light, dark, amber, and sweet of these specifically filtered beers. So they actually had various types of beer, which is awesome. And then the cuneiform tablets also show us the birth of the concept of a dowry, with a bride price as a forerunner to the early European bride ale, which is the origin of the word bridal, which was payment of beer from the bride's family to the groom's. So I love this idea that the bridal word
We
is
need to
actually
bring this back.
the bride ale.
I think you could have like a layaway plan where people could just pay you for a bridal ale dowry.
Oh my God.
And then when it's full, you get a keg or something.
So I
Would
every
that mean we were like a bank almost, like a currency exchange?
every episode I'm
Well,
writing
grain is
down
edible money.
ideas by Gary. So we got Schrodinger's cask. And
I love it.
Now we have this layaway plan for
Layaway
brides.
plan of dowries. But that's cool. The word bridal, bride ale. There you go. Pay for your women and beer. That
Does
sounds
that have
awful.
anything to do with the Great Fall at Yosemite Bridal Veil?
I'm not
You
sure.
know, roundabout way.
Maybe. I mean, if it's bridal, the bride ale.
Wouldn't that be
that's the
cool if
connection.
Bridal Veil was actually all ale coming down?
Have you ever been there at like full blast?
Yes.
That's
awesome.
That would be a lot of beer.
That would be a ton of beer.
That would be the entire McFleshman's production in a year in probably 10 seconds.
Yes.
So anyways,
Distracted.
Go team.
the ancient world, is there anything more? I mean, it's kind of, they did this for thousands of years.
Yeah, and
it
I
goes
think-
back to the earliest.
Right. What ultimately started to change things, and I say started because we're still going to see women in the primary beer production role through really the European Renaissance. But once civilizations form large urban centers and specialization of labor takes place, and the amount of people needed to farm and gather food, and while that number goes down, and you start to put other people into specialty areas, okay, brewing becomes more specialized. And because the job carries with it a degree of importance within the community, then you start to see men wanting to get into that.
Oh, you power hungry ass.
And I'd like to point out that she was
Not
looking
you.
at Gary and Bobby when she
Oh, I
said
was
that.
staring directly at you. No, I'm kidding. Sorry, I'm kidding. That was a joke.
I got it.
But no, I think it's interesting to see how, in reading the history of beer, I have this book on women's place in the brew house, and I am sad because I've actually read a lot of beer books, and this one's been on my nightstand for months, and I've only read a couple chapters, but there's only a few sources. There's actually so much more written about men in the brewing world than there is about women, and I just want to point that out. The
Right.
frustration therein.
I think that might be a factor of there's not as much historical data from thousands of years ago. If you
Right.
look at the period where women were brewing,
Yep.
it's only in the last 500 years that we have
Actually started to write stuff down.
Books.
or
Yeah.
that stuff that survived.
Right. And, to the victor goes the spoils, and those that were writing had a different slant to the story.
How much of this time that women were brewing were they experimenting with what preceded hops, and how many people became sick?
Well, we're going to
and-
get to Hildy in a minute.
Okay, yeah, I didn't want to get too
Because-
far into it, but
Yeah.
there must have been some experimental herbs and spices that gave the effects they were looking for that might not have been the healthiest every time.
Yeah, so this is where we kind of merge into a conversation that we had here on the show not so long ago about the spice mix, that griot that was used, which again factors into the Reformation because the Catholics controlled the trade in these spice mixes that contained everything from bog myrtle to nuts and raisins and other microflora
Flora.
to all of these other things. And then you would basically almost, I'm kind of envisioning it, how you would add hops in secondary fermentation in like a mesh bag where you would almost just drop this in.
McFleshman's Special Bog Myrtle.
Oh my God.
Just
We're
saying.
going to have a Renaissance fair some point that we sponsor, and that has to show up.
Wow, that would be, yeah.
What is bog myrtle anyway? Do we? Can you buy bog myrtle these days?
I do not know.
Does Amazon? Okay, we got a quick Amazon
Yeah,
check.
if Amazon has, or if it
Can
doesn't,
I buy
then no.
bog myrtle?
Gary is going to be contributing 300,000-year-old amber as well as bog myrtle.
Oh, it's organic. That's cool.
There we go.
So sometime in the next 6 to 9 months, there will be an ale generated from the McFleshman's pilot system
With the amber?
with
yeah.
not only Gary's prehistoric amber, but also the organic bog myrtle from today.
There you have it.
Sign me up.
But
like-
coming back to
Yeah,
just
yeah.
the topic at hand,
What does it look like to you?
Those look like little hops.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Bog myrtle. They look
Bog
like little
myrtle looks like
hops.
little hops.
What?
oh,
It is a
Fair.
proto hop.
Talk about bad marketing. Bog myrtle is not the name of something that sounds
no,
fancy.
it's
You
not.
could have named Jade that.
Oh God, no. No.
Give her a running start.
Myrtle.
Myrtle, yeah. Hildegard Myrtle.
As we kind of think about at post Vikings, the fall of the Roman Empire, et cetera, women are still doing the lion's share of the brewing when it is being done in this domestic capacity.
So I have a question. I don't mean to cut you off, but women brew for the house, so them and the few others that they serve,
Yeah.
or not necessarily serve, but people come to their house. Okay, here's your water. How much of a commercialized process was it?
Well, I have a quote for you.
Oh, I love this.
Right. David knows how excited I've been about this quote.
Oh my God,
So this is the quote from
is this your high school?
Well, I taught from this book.
Oh.
This is the old book for my AP World History class.
Just to give everyone listening just a sense of this, it's like thin pages and it looks like the size of a dictionary with lots of text.
Very few pictures.
Very few pictures.
Yeah,
I
this
want to
is-
read that.
I have many copies of this.
I like this.
You'll get one.
Go team.
So this is from a book written by a historian of the medieval European period, Barbara Hannawalt, who writes that women dominated in the production of ale for the community market.
Oh,
So we're talking, this is about 11, maybe the 12th century. They had to know how to mix the correct proportions of barley, water, yeast, and hops in 12, so then this would be after Hildy then if they're using hops. In 12-gallon vats of hot liquid, and we're going to come back to you for a discussion of how much 12 gallons is.
is that a barrel?
Brewing was hard and dangerous work. Records of the English coroner's courts reveal that 5% of women who had died lost their lives in brewing accidents falling into the vats of boiling liquid.
No.
5%. That's a
lot of women.
Stunning amount of brewing deaths.
Oh my God. There are fewer shark attacks these days.
Right. Ale was the universal drink of the common people in Northern Europe. By modern American standards, the rate of consumption was heroic, as a typical monk in 12th century England was allotted, and this is not a typo, 3 gallons of ale per day, which is a stunning amount. So if they're brewing in 12-gallon batches and the volume that's being consumed is that heroic, and I can see the math, the numbers. There's like an
yeah.
algorithm going off in Bobby's head right now. Talk to us a little bit about that ratio of 12 gallons,
Well, I assume this all comes about because they didn't have the ability to make big tanks like we have.
Well, now hang
Big-
on. Was this
yeah.
during Lent? Because during Lent, the monks and such wouldn't eat anything. So their caloric intake, the only thing was beer. So if it was a monk drinking 3 gallons a day.
And they made what were called table beers, patter beers that were for all-day consumption year-round.
So here's the next line. a working man in the fields working for a 10-hour day probably drank significantly more than a monk.
Yeah.
So I guess my point in bringing this quote up,
They're brewing on the daily.
right, they're brewing a lot.
So how would
Into a lot of
fermentation
vessels.
happen then? That's
Yeah.
a lot of. Oh my gosh! I'm just now thinking back to our homebrew days.
Well, that's what they're
where I
doing. This is
swear
not a
the-
big batch.
Oh, of
this
course.
is 100 pints.
And these are, so that 100 pints is what you're
Yeah.
going to get from
But it has
12
to be
gallons.
big enough to fall in and die.
Yeah, that's the. Well, is it? It's on the stove.
They
like,
might be creating 12-gallon casks of it.
That
out
could
of
be
a larger
that would
vat.
Yeah.
12 gallons. How much fills a bathtub? That's like 30 gallons, isn't it?
Well, a little more than 2 5-gallon
At
buckets.
some point, we're going to have that photograph. Surely it will be CGI or AI, but we're going to fill the open fermenter with 547 and get a picture of a couple of our fans in it. Not for real. It's just for.
Why is that what you're bringing up?
Oh,
right
we're
now?
talking about volume. I can picture what 300 gallons looks like. That's the biggest bathtub.
300 gallons. I'm
So
talking about
that
12.
the open
Yeah.
fermenter is 300,
300 gallons. Yeah, just for.
Okay, so that's like a dunk tank.
So that feels like the size tank maybe we're talking here that they
Okay.
would have brewed in.
Well, and I think this is
And parse
also
it out.
the brew
well,
kettle.
like a turkey fryer, the pot that you put the turkey in. If you're going to do a turkey
Yeah.
fryer type pot, the big pot that's like bigger. It's like kind of game day chili. The
It's
big,
essentially the size of what people would think of as a beer keg.
pot. Yeah,
It's a half barrel. It's not as big as
That's
that.
about
It's
5
close.
gallons,
That's
right?
15 for
Oh.
half.
well, it's a half barrel.
So, but
Yeah.
this is producing 12 gallons of
What kind of
fermentable
vessels?
beer. So the volume would be significantly larger for the vessel that they're falling in. If we're coming back to
That's
that
where we're
falling in and
going.
dying.
I feel like
now,
they're
granted, You
boiling.
can fall in a small vial or small vat if you could fit
Let's-
into it
let's
of
back-
boiling water, and that would still hurt.
Let's back up a second. They're not of a time where they could boil. They couldn't just have a flame under these wooden containers.
Correct.
So they're throwing rocks in. So this is Stein Brewing. So they're throwing hot rocks in to boil this. And that's where a lot of this danger comes from. These exploding rocks. These are really not.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, they're very dangerous.
Do tell, Bobby. Okay, so the rocks. Go for it.
It's called Stein Brewing. It's how you would heat liquid in a wooden vessel.
Okay,
and
so
so they would
there's-
put these in, and they would dip them out, and they would add more, and so on until they got the length of boil they needed to pull off the production.
You're a rock person, Gary. What's inside of a rock that would make it explode upon heating?
Water.
There you go.
Boom.
Depends on the rock.
Literally, boom.
But basically, the pressure would build up. And
It's like
explode.
popcorn.
Yeah.
Go to
So that's probably as much to do with it as anything. They had different techniques to make that happen, but this is before we had metal vessels.
Right. So, okay, well, let's go back to this because we're obviously on the subject of women in brewing. And one of the reasons today that there's sort of a chauvinistic approach to women in brewing, and I know it's talked about in that book,
Oh, it
and
is.
it's talked about on almost every page
Please
that
tell
I've
me where
read,
you're getting to. Yes.
that it involves a certain amount of physical labor that is difficult to achieve, ignoring the fact that women are capable of doing a lot of physical things.
About to
number
say,
one.
my 6-year-old weighs like 55 pounds.
Right, and you're carrying her all
Oh,
over
yeah.
the town. But if you're having to take these, I'm assuming we're not using like gravel. We're
No,
using
yeah.
larger stones
Yeah, I
that
would
are
imagine.
that are being put,
Yeah,
in
high
this,
heat capacity. Yep.
in this vessel.
Yep. Yep.
This clearly changes the dynamic of the entire
And
situation.
before you even get to that, you have the mashing process. You got to get the grain and the water mixed in together, and then you got to stir that and eventually empty that and do this again and again and again. It's
Right.
extreme labor in those conditions. And the grain at that point was not bred to brew with as well as it has been after this long. So it would have been a sticky mess, I think, for sure.
they're doing, I think, far more physical work than we would maybe assign them credit for, which is I'm glad you brought up the rock piece. Mm-hmm. Because
It's always fascinating me how they were able to boil back then, and that's the technique I'm familiar with.
have you ever brewed with rocks?
No, we kicked around doing a Stein beer. I think that Lakefront has one called River West Stein. It may be born of a pilot batch they might have done at some point. I doubt they do a full-scale batch that way, but I think it was born of a stunt that they did. It would be really cool to try. You can imagine some of the flavors you would get. Really intense caramelization. Because these rocks are hundreds and hundreds of degrees, and on that you get some good melanoidin and caramel production.
This is like beer stockland, the poke your goat.
Yeah.
Yeah,
gimmick
that's
that
what I
we
was
do.
going to bring that up
Yeah.
when we do that outside.
Yeah,
with-
where you take
we
a
go
hop.
back to Hildegard of Bingen
Yes,
for a moment?
okay. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
yes,
I
we have
digress.
Because
Hildy.
we've mentioned her many times, but I think it needs to be stressed. I don't think she invented it, but hers is the oldest writing we have that talks about the use of hops in beer, and she uses it as a preservative, not something for taste. So I don't know if she would have been a 547 fan or not, but
She would have.
you think so?
Yes.
I'd like to think she would appreciate our public house pint that has quite a bit of hops, but you can't taste it because the malt is so forward.
I just did an episode on Hildegard of Bingen,
Yeah.
which is why.
I know. I'm excited about this.
Of all the things she was definitely a believer of the scientific method, whether or not it went by the name. And I think that is why we use hops.
Why didn't we
Yeah.
name Jade Hildy? We talked about it, didn't we? About naming our daughter.
Maybe we did.
Hildy?
Yeah, it was in the running.
I guess
Yeah.
we'd already named the beer.
Right.
That was a
Beer,
problem.
Right.
child,
We
Yep.
named the beer first.
tomato.
Yep.
I do have to.
The beers are like our children too.
Right. I do have to throw just a small amount of shade at Hildy right now, though.
Oh, wow. Oh, dude.
Yeah, no, I'm unintentional
Laser death
shade.
stare.
I am getting the stare, but unintentional shade because with the transition towards hops as a primary ingredient of beer, and the Protestant Reformation certainly contributed to this as well, it added a kind of a market for this that produced a capitalization of the brewing process that started to phase out women because women were like largely the domestic producers of beer, and it became more of a commercial endeavor, and you had to generate capital.
Oh, because it was preserved.
Yes.
Interesting.
So it started to kill off the small regionalism.
Right. The
Yeah.
need, because
I
the
see what you're
beer, the
saying.
beer that we were talking about with the falling, the
Yeah.
falling in, et cetera, and the dying, the 5%. These are beers that are very, very small. And when I say small, I'm talking about in their alcohol content. They do not ferment very long. They're
No.
table beer. If you keep them for more than a limited period of time, they're going to sour.
So what you're telling me is by the preservation, so adding hops, so the preservative nature of it kind of killed the domestic, like local,
Yes.
truly local beer,
Yeah.
which means
Gave
that
rise to a regional producer.
more more global, for lack of a better
For
phrase.
that time.
And this
Beer
is
for
where
that
you
time.
start to see some of the rise of European breweries.
Right.
That
but
was
also,
many centuries after this.
But you could then extrapolate that argument to say that kind of the downfall of truly local beer was the addition of hops, which means that the IPA killed the truly amazing pale ale, which would have been a local beer. Because preserving it to get around the African coast
There's
is
a
what
whole
they did.
there's a whole show we can do on pale ales, which
I'm
were
just
also
saying,
extremely well hopped.
So that would mean that you're saying that the 547 killed the true beer, which was the MSB.
For those that are listening in, we're having some technical difficulties here in the studio, and I couldn't hear a word that Allison said. So I'm going to have to respond to her after I listen to the show after it's been broadcast.
Just saying.
And I'm sitting next to Joel, and he's got a lot of notes. He hasn't turned
Yes,
the
oh
page
gosh,
yet.
sorry.
So I don't know if we are avoiding turning the page
Nope,
or
we're not. But I will say this: Hildy is a pioneer.
yes.
There
And she
is-
wasn't just a brewer.
No,
no.
she was a nun. She was a scientist. She was an abbess.
This is when we say listen to Gary's podcast, which is
Right.
probably how you found our
She
podcast.
she had a rather late start in life.
Really?
She was the 10th child,
Oh, bless her heart.
and it was common to have one of your children go into a religious life. So her parents basically gave her to the convent at a really early age. Her mentor was an anchoress. And an anchoress, so there were men and women who did this, and they basically lived their lives in a cell attached to a church. And once they were in, they never left for the rest of their life. And there were windows where people would bring them food, or they would give advice to people and stuff so they could talk through the window, but they were kind of considered like a living saint. And Hildegard was not this. And then this woman, when she died, I'm trying to think of her name, but when she died, Hildy became the abbess, the head of her convent, And at the age of like 42, so she had these visions throughout her whole life that later people have said that she had migraines or something. But when she was 42, she never really had written anything. And then she just went nuts. And she started writing tons of stuff. She began writing music. She began writing medical works, religious texts, you name it. And part of her work on beer was actually part of a much greater work because she worked in the convent garden. And she became accustomed with all of the plants and their medical uses.
Yeah, the botany work that
and
she
things
did.
like that. And so
Or
this
the writing it down.
Right. So this, in her mind, this was just a part of that. That the hops were just, here's another use for this plant. It preserves beer. And what she wrote is actually rather small. It's not like she wrote a book on beer. It's like a sentence or two, and that's it. But it was the first reference to the use of hops in beer.
This inspires me more than anything else because I am also 42 right now. And I was like, oh my God, I still got time. This is amazing.
She was a polymath.
She's an artist on Spotify. You can go look for Hildegard of Bingen. You can listen to her music. It's a kind of like Gregorian chant. She is the patron saint. She was made a saint in the Catholic Church in 2012. She's the patron saint of beer and music.
That's amazing.
Not intimidating at all.
Nope.
These accomplishments.
That's when you got
And she's
your...
she's a doctor of the Catholic Church and only one of 4 women to have ever received that title.
But inadvertently,
Hildy.
her scientific inquiries, which with the hops, etc.
And she also developed the Lucre faucet.
Not confirmed. But so,
well, it was
in a
just-
sense, she did start the masculinization of beer.
That is an interesting argument.
The industrialization centuries later.
Right.
She
Which
laid
was the
bedrock for that.
masculinization.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, independent of that statement from Joel, just what Gary shared, I mean, it's no wonder Bobby and I, when we went down and actually bought our antique back bar that adorns our tap room, we came up with the names of like 10 of the beers that we still have today. And for the Pilsner, it was like, well, how can we name it after Hildy in some, or actually after Hildegard in some way? And then the Hildy Pills, I don't remember who came up with it first, but that's
So we still call it Hildy.
I think it is the
She's
best named beer you have.
Thank you. I agree. Well, maybe. MSB is pretty damn good.
Joel's very quiet right
No,
now.
I'm not saying that in terms of the beer itself. I'm saying in terms of the name.
No, the Hildy, yeah. And what's funny is that she was originally supposed to be named the Hildegard Pilsner, with a nickname, the Hildy Pills. But she would be officially the Hildegard because, you know, you have your official name, but then you go by like your nickname sort of thing. But then it turned into that she was only ever named the Hildy. So I think I'm the only one that calls her the Hildegard.
The artwork's hanging on the wall downstairs too, and the artwork's amazing.
The artist.
We should have had the artist name at our.
At our
the ready.
fingertips.
I have been down there many
Yeah.
times, and people have ordered a Hildy, and I've like been that guy. And I explained to him, well, you know what it's named after.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
It's
I love
like, and they
those.
can see the artwork, and it's like it's a nun.
Speaking of named after, I don't want to hijack this podcast, but we're thinking of renaming our rye IPA St. Anthony's Fire. And I think maybe Gary knows that reference. It's what happens after prolonged exposure to poison. And the poison in this case was from fungus that grew on rye. And people over time developed ergotism, which made them act like witches and eventually get burned to the stake. So there's a whole long roundabout story here connecting it back to rye. And someone said, we should name this thing St. Anthony's. And I said, that'll be great. Joel will love telling that story every time that he pours it.
Because it's hard to explain the snail.
The snail, I know it's currently it's called a snail ale right now, and that's
Which is
equally
great
difficult.
for other reasons.
Yeah.
So back to women.
Plague. Let's go there.
Plague?
Yes.
Back to women plague. That's the first thing
Why
you
don't
come
we
up
get
with?
to the plague, the start of our next episode? Because
Okay.
we know you like
I
547,
just
which
wanna
is
talk
a
about
plague
witches.
beer. So obviously we need to
Yeah,
talk
because
more.
people flock like locusts to just have one.
Sure.
Oh, that kind of plague. Wait, what plague? Like bubonic plague or
Yeah,
like
plague.
biblical plague?
Well, the
No,
plague of
the-
Justinian, that's what we
Boy,
refer to.
Oh.
kinda
you guys know how to set up a
tying it back in.
cliffhanger.
Yeah.
This is spot on.
Anyways, that concludes this episode of Respecting the Beer. The producer of Respecting the Beer of David Calso. Without David, this show would not exist.
We love you,
Make sure to
David.
subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player so you never miss an episode. And feel free to join the Facebook group to get updates between the episodes and support the show over on Patreon, where you can listen to the bits that don't make it into the real show. Links to both of these are in the show notes. And until next time, please remember to respect the beer.